Hi, my name is Erin Hartwell. On the forums, I go by Corporea. Today, we're going to be doing color blending. And what that means is we're going to use some color gradients. So I will bring my fancy color chart here. As you can see, there is a darker color here and a lighter color here. Same thing. So we're going to try to mix between these colors and get some smooth blends for our miniature painting. So that's what we'll cover today. So we will be using this grub here, and as you can see, the colors from our chart that we saw earlier, we can also see on this grub where he has a darker color here and a lighter color on top. So we're going to try to learn how to blend those. And you can use all sorts of different colors. It doesn't have to be just black and white. As you look at this, you can see you can go from a red to a yellow, from a dark green to a light green, or even from a red to a green, which is very exciting. But today what we're going to be doing is using the red-blue mix right here. Okay, start with base coating with my darker color. So I'm going to put that on him, and we're just going to cover him really well. And I might sing while I paint because
you always dab like that?
I do always dab like that with my base coats. And the main thing is with bones, I don't want to thin my paint. I want to make sure that it's a good thick coat, so this is coming kind of straight out of the bottle. And I want to get it in all the grooves, and I have a terrible brush for the purpose of this. This is my super awesome base coating brush. I have several of these, and they don't last very long, but that's okay. I also have some nicer brushes for the finer details. But yeah, I am abusive to my base coating brushes because that's what they're there for. So let's get him all covered in this red. And sometimes when I do this, I may go straight to my next color and add it in wet, but as a base coat on bones, it's a lot easier to get a good solid coat down before you switch over to another color. So I may hair dry him for a moment and come back to painting him. Okay, so now we have Mr. Grub covered with a darker color. And as you can see, even here, it's not a very good base coat, but we're going to be blending on top of it anyway. It can be messy. It does not have to be fancy. So next what I'm going to do is grab some of this blue, and we're going to put it right up on top. And this is not blending right now, but we are going to blend it in a minute.
You're still using that base coating brush for that?
Yep, still using the base coating brush. Yep, haven't switched to anything else. And then what I often will do at that point is I will actually not even clean my brush, but go back. You can see how I still have some of the turquoise on my brush, and I've put some of the red back on it. And then I'm just going to kind of work into the shadows. And what I'm doing is kind of moving downwards. Okay. And this is sort of a feathering stroke. I don't know if it's... Make sure that it's kind of coming through. And then I go back and I grab some more of my blue, clean off my brush a little bit, come back. And because both of those areas are wet, I am just blending them together. Does that show up okay? There we go. So what I've done is, even though I haven't gotten to my highest highlight up here, I've got a little bit of the blue in there. And if I think of him, if he's sitting on the gaming table like this, he's going to have more of this blue up here, right, than he is down in his deepest shadows, because I'm thinking of the light coming from up here, from above. So I'm doing this. This is sort of a wet blending method. You can layer it, which I think is slower, but probably looks prettier. But for my gaming pieces, if I'm just doing this quickly, this took, what, I don't know, a minute, 2 minutes, not a lot of time. So that's that first layer, and I'll let that dry with some clever hair drying, and we'll be back to it. Looking at him, let's see if we can get him, there we go. You can start to see where that blue is coming in. So at this point, I really do like to clean my brush off, and I think I'm going to switch to the fancy, hang on. The fancy brush. So it's got a nicer tip, and I can do a lot more detail work with it. All right, so I've got Mr. Grub, and we're going to work some more blue in.
You still haven't thinned any of these out?
Nope. Nah, don't need to really thin this. For blending, while you can do that, and it will make... the basic thing is you just don't want to leave a lot of texture. You don't want your paint to be so goopy that it leave streaks or lines or large chunks of paint. And then again, this point, since I'm working with this color, see how I'm feathering up? I'm moving my stroke up towards the top there. I think, yeah, that kind of comes through. What that's doing is when you start a stroke of paint, you're pulling the color with you, so wherever you want the color to be brightest, and in this case, since I'm using the turquoise, it will be the top, you want to deposit that paint as far up to the top of the miniature as you can. So that starts to, so you can kind of see a gradient between that red on the bottom and that blue up at the top. So we're getting there. All right, get just a little bit more. And at this point, because my layers are a little thinner, because I am using slightly, I added a little bit of water to my brush. Adding the water to my brush gives me just enough water to thin my paint on my wet palette, so that helps. Here we go. So that's starting to look a little bluer. Might do a little bit more up in there. All right, so that's Mr. Grub. And then what I'll do next is I'll add this much lighter green. And we can go all the way up to white too if we want to. All right, so let's work some of this really bright green in here. And this is wet. I'm not going to dry this with the hairdryer because at this point I do kind of want to blend this next layer in. Is that, yeah, that's showing up pretty well.
Is there an advantage to doing it while it's dry?
While it's dry. If you're doing a layering technique where you're wanting to have down a layer and then do another layer just inside that layer and then another layer just inside that layer, having it dry will keep you from pulling paint off the layer before. If I am wet blending, which means just moving the paint back and forth between two different colors, which I'm doing here, they should be wet because you're going to want to work with them until they dry, and then you're going to start to pull that paint off as well. Yeah. Let's see, we'll just kind of back and forth. I'm going to grab a little bit of that red, work it back in. And so sometimes you can trick your eye with blends. You can see on the bottom here where my feathering stroke has left some just lines. I can go back over that with this red because it's a darker color and go with a sideways stroke. See if I can do that. And I've thinned this paint just a bit with some water. And I can kind of glaze over that. And those lines will start to go away the more layers I do. And as it dries, it'll be a little less visible. All right, so let me grab some more of my, and one thing that I do when I paint miniatures is I will go back and forth between different areas because I'm lazy and I don't know where my hairdryer is. So I tend to just wait for it to dry while working on something else. Otherwise, you can mess up your layers if your paint dries on you. We do put just a little bit of that blue, that very light blue up here, very light blue up here. In between, sometimes I will wet my brush either on my paper towel or I'll use a little bit of rinse water and then wet it so that if it maintains its point, if it's, oh, where's my point? There we go. Here, we'll switch out. If it's got a good point on it, you know it's got enough moisture in it to do what you want. If it, having enough water on your brush for blending is a good thing. I'm going to work a little bit more of that brighter color up in here. So I do a combination of that wet blending at first and then start to do some layers. So here's Mr. Grub, and you can start to see the transition of color on him. And I might come back and put, see if I can reach, yeah, there we go. Put a little bit of, you know, a bright highlight on top, and then eventually kind of smooth around that. So you can see that white spot, and that kind of helps him pop a little bit as well. Putting something dark like this line here next to something light like that will help make that form look more rounded. So I do a lot of really messy painting up until the last minute, which is why, and this is probably a frustrating thing for people with competition things, is it's really going to look ugly like until like the last 10% of your time, because it's still going to look messy until you're ready to put those final glazes on. Yeah, there's several ways to blend. I guess I should probably cover those. Those would probably be good. You can do layering, just where you put down a layer of paint and then you put down your next layer. Oh, I can actually demonstrate this on paper. Ho, 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 this might work. All right, let's see, let's go back to my crappy brush for this. All right, so I can put down a layer of, and I will often work on watercolor paper. This is just like a cheap watercolor paper you can get from the hobby store. So I've got a layer of red, so we can see that. And then I'm going to dab. And this should dry kind of quickly. You could use the hairdryer, but yeah. And then what I might do is mix a half shade in between. It's kind of a, this will be kind of a purple color. See how that's not quite as dark. It's got more blue in it than that purple, but it's lighter than the teal, you know, this teal that's right over here. Okay, so then I can move this layer to the next section. And what the problem with the watercolor paper is it's designed for watercolor, so it's transparent. My paint is thin, so now I can kind of, there we go. So you can see that dark red area and that slightly purple area, and I've covered that next layer. And then what I can do next is, in this case I'm cleaning, I'm letting my layers dry, because if I mess with this, if I pick at that paint, then I'm going to pick the particles of paint out of it, and I'll leave streaks or openings in the paint. They'll look like little windows, and they're really hard to fix because they are actually a textured thing on the miniature. Where the paint is absent is a tiny little microscopic dip in the miniature, and if you layer on top of that, it'll eventually get a texture to it. It's a pain in the butt. Ugh, terrible. All right, so next I'm going to take my, there we go. So you'll see with this, see how that's not as smooth a blend? Go back to my middling color. This is not as even to me. Make the camera happy. There we go. You can see that there is a difference of color, but it is not as smooth maybe as the one where I kind of worked at it and feathered between while it was wet. And then we're going to mix a half shade here, maybe 3/4. All right, we'll put that there. So that is kind of like layering, only you would do many more layers in between so that it's less of a transition. So that's layering. There's wet blending, which is kind of what I was doing on Mr. Grubb, where I'm kind of pushing and pulling the paint, and then eventually I'll glaze on top. I'll thin my paint. And that's the third way, is that you can start with an already, they do this a lot in things like oil, where they'll put down a grayscale, like a monochrome underpainting or a sepia underpainting, and then you glaze and glaze and glaze on top of it to bring out the colors from what you have underneath, which is basically just like a shift in value. And I didn't bring a straight black and white, but that's like going from black to white. So this was Reaper Toolbox. Our topic was color blending. My name is Erin Hartwell, also Corporea on the forums. Feel free to ask us any questions if you have any, and we'd be happy to help.
Sweet.
Okay. Yay, thanks. That was fun.